Today, I want to talk briefly about developmentally appropriate practices again, and to also address some specific questions, debunk myths, and look at examples in practice. NACE, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, adopted a revised position statement on DAP in April of 2020 and just released its publication here in November of the same year. They have rephrased the three cornerstones of DAP. Now we're referring to, and it's the same concepts with slight rephrasing. You talk about individuality, which is the child's own tweaks, their own experiences. Commonality, which is our milestones. And context, which is that cultural and societal impact. Commonality of development and learning is driven by your milestones and Kansas Early Learning Standards. Two really great resources for milestones are the CDC, so the Center for Disease Control, and the American Academy of Pediatrics through their website, healthychildren.org. Additionally, you should be using your state standards. So in Kansas, those are the Kansas Early Learning Standards. What do these tell us? There's a couple different things we have to keep in mind here. Children learn at different rates. Development is dependent upon experiences, so the context. And usually a milestone or developmental area is considered a delay or a concern when it is at least 6 months behind. So for example, if you looked at the CDC's website and you pulled up a 4-month-old child, you would want to see most of these behaviors. You wouldn't necessarily see all of them. If you see any of these, act early, red flags, you need to talk to a pediatrician or an educator of some kind of early childhood professional to put you in contact with the agency who provides special education services, because they also will provide free development screenings for children. Acting early, these milestones are actually put in negative, you'll see phrasing, where the milestones are all put in positive. So these act early signs are things that you would have seen at birth or at 2 months of age, possibly. So babies, it may be a little faster than that, 6 months. Then if you go over here to your 1 year or even your 9 months, because it's all relative to the time that their age, their developmental age. We also know that individuality is referring to the milestones a child has demonstrated, the child's temperament, the child's own weaknesses and strengths, the child's preferences and dislikes. We're looking at the individual. And then we have that context, the culture of the child. They're growing up within the context of the family, and the family's growing up within the context of their community, and their community is in the context of society. And we know that all of those levels impact each other. This is much of Brofenbrenner's theory, which we talk about in both ECE 101 and ECE 102. So the NACE has defined 9 principles to guide our understanding of what developmentally appropriate practices look like, and how you come upon this decision that something is developmentally appropriate. Because it's not cut and dry. What is always right for one child is not always right for another child. What is always right for one program is not always right for another program. And so we have to be very careful not to make sweeping statements about what is appropriate and not appropriate. We have to pull to research. And so these 9 principles are all based on the child development and brain research and understandings that we have and that we have studied in ECE 101, Early Childhood Growth and Development, and ECE 102, Introduction to Early Childhood. These are the same principles that you would find in general psychology classes, developmental psychology classes, introduction to sociology classes, and introduction to social work classes, and sociology of marriage and family classes. So these are not just specific to our field, but these bleed into other areas of academic and understanding. Number one, development and learning are dynamic processes that reflect the complex interplay between a child's biological characteristics and the environment. It's that bleeding together of milestones and context. All domains of child development are important, and each domain supports and is supported by the others. So when you look at the Kansas Early Learning Standards, they bleed together. They support each other. Number three, play. Play promotes joyful learning that fosters self-regulation, language, cognitive and social competencies, as well as content knowledge across disciplines. Play is essential for all children, birth through age 8. Number four, although general progressions of development and learning can be identified, cornerstone, right? Variations due to cultural context, experiences, and individual differences must also be considered. Second, cornerstone. Number five, children are active learners from birth, constantly taking in and organizing information to create meaning through their relationships, their interactions with their environment, and their overall experiences. Active relationships, interactions, overall experiences. Number six, children's motivation to learn is increased when their learning environment fosters their sense of belonging, purpose, and agency. Curricula and teaching methods build on each child's assets by connecting their experiences in the school or learning environment to their home and community settings. Motivations increased. Meaningful learning. Number seven, children learn in an integrated fashion that cuts across academic principles or subject areas. Because the foundations of subject area knowledge are established in early childhood, educators need subject area knowledge, an understanding of the learning progressions within each subject area, and pedagogical knowledge about teaching each subject area's content effectively. Number eight, development and learning advance when children are challenged to achieve at a level just beyond their current mastery, and when they have many opportunities to reflect on and practice newly acquired skills. These are directly related to what we have studied with zone of proximal development and scaffolding. Number nine, used responsibly and intentionally, technology and interactive media can be valuable tools for supporting children's development and learning. So you'll notice, like with number 9 especially, there's a lot of room for interpretation there, right? Because responsibly and intentionally, technology and interactive media, how we might use that when children can go to school all day and parents are working like they typically would have, would be very different than in today's time, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. Child care centers are closed or operating at half capacity. Parents aren't working and possibly keeping children at home. And so the use of technology is going to be a lot more right now. But we still have to be careful about how we do it. So this phrasing is very important because it's timeless. And again, it doesn't give you black and white answers. It allows for you to have to apply and understand the context. So again, another principle, right? So it's very messy. Developmentally appropriate practices, much like any major concept in life, is very messy. It's not black and white. So let's use these 9 principles to talk about the balance of the day. Whether it's a half-day program, whether it's a full-day program, or whether we're talking about infants and toddlers, or if we're talking about preschoolers. The balance of a day. So circle time, group time. If we flip back these slides and we look at these 9 principles, where do you see anything about children learning in large groups? You don't. Large group meaning the whole class. If you have a small class of 6 to 8, that might be considered a small group, but it's everybody together, essentially, when I say the word whole group. And so we don't see that here because it is not ideal. Now, though, we have to consider the other core principles of DAP. So let's talk context. It is expected that preschoolers should be ready for school, right? For kindergarten. And to be ready for that, you have to be able to function as a group at times. And so in preschool, we do start beginning to practice functioning as a group. But should we expect 3-year-olds to sit and listen to a teacher, whether it's singing songs or doing calendar time or reading a story? Should we expect extended amount of group time with our children? And the answer is no. But it might be something that is appropriate because of context for a bit of time. So it's that beginning. That is the zone of proximal development. That is helping a child master something just beyond their current mastery level. Teacher-guided learning. Where in these 9 principles does it say that teachers should instruct and fill the vessel of a child to learn? And that's how children learn. It doesn't. Instead, we hear words like play. We hear active, meaningful through relationships, interactions with environment, overall experiences. Not teacher filling the child up with knowledge or directing the child on skill-based driven activities. Play promotes joyful learning. Play is essential. We also come to the concept of motivation and the concept of integrated learning, that children learn in an integrated fashion that cuts across academic areas. Worksheets do not cut across academic disciplines. Worksheets do not connect to a child's life and meaningful experiences. Free play. Where does free play fall within these concepts? Several places, right? Because it allows for all domains to be, or multiple domains to be addressed. It also allows for play itself, right? It also allows for cultural context by introducing and connecting the child's culture and community in the classroom and the play through materials and props. It engages in the active learning and the creating meaning through interactions with the environment. Play also allows for that social competency which builds relationships, as we see in number 5. It increases the motivation, which addresses all of our approaches to learning standards. It also cuts across the curriculum. It is very easy to integrate academic areas and all developmental domains when you look at center-based or play-based learning. It really allows a teacher to individually address mastery for each child and scaffold and identify that zone of proximal development for each child. So when we look, and same goes for outdoor play. I will go back to free play a little bit, and I want to address that free play doesn't mean that the children are on their own. That's when that relationships and the interactions become very important. It's also, as I addressed earlier, or when we started this, developmentally appropriate practice as defined by NACI states that it is based upon educators designing and implementing learning environments to help all children achieve their full potential across all domains of development and across all content areas. Some of the most important work of a teacher happens when the children aren't in the classroom. And that work is putting together the learning environment to establish context, to create and manipulate how the children will interact with the materials in the classroom, how the children will play. The second most important work that a teacher will do will be in those one-on-one and small group interactions during the child's play, pulling out the language, asking the thoughtful questions, helping the children develop more complex understanding of concepts of their world of information, of practicing different skills across their developmental domains that will lead to mastery and kindergarten readiness. An example might be fine motor skills, and how are those developed in an appropriate manner for children. When children go to kindergarten, they're expected to hold a pencil correctly. They're expected to write their name, to write. Some kindergartens expect the children to write all the letters. And yet we have to think about what are those precursors to being able to do those things, and how do we encourage that? Do we do that with worksheets? Do we teach a child to cut with scissors by cutting out lines and zigzags and circles? Is that how we do this? Well, do any of those address those 9 principles? Not DAP would be tracing or writing your name a certain number of times. Not developmentally appropriate would be rote writing of letters or rote copying of letters or shapes. Developmentally appropriate practices would put play and meaningful experiences first. Play-Doh and clay, hammering, sawing, screwing, washing dishes, digging with a small trowel, picking up beads or beans with tweezers, any activity having to use a pincer grasp, your first 3 fingers coming together, any creative visual arts experience, writing your name for a true purpose, a birthday card, your artwork, signing into class, choosing a snack preference. If you're trying to write your name for those purposes, that's meaningful. That's a real experience. And you can encourage that multiple times throughout a day. Journaling, writing centers, dramatic play centers, block centers, listening centers, all sorts of centers allow for fine motor development. These pictures show developmentally appropriate opportunities to develop fine motor skills. By offering hand strengthening, hand-eye coordination, and dexterity activities to children, by scaffolding their learning and their practice and doing it a variety of ways, children can walk into kindergarten with the handwriting skills necessary to be successful. Take a look at that little boy cutting. That little boy is just cutting paper, no lines. But by doing so, he is figuring out how to move those scissors, how to cut a big piece, how to cut a small piece. He's figuring what happens when he goes slowly and when he cuts quickly. He's experimenting, and with that, he's analyzing. So then when he comes to cutting for a purpose, such as an art activity, he will be able to intentionally use those scissors. And from there, he will transfer that when he's sitting in kindergarten and asked to cut out the pictures to glue in 2 different areas, sorting by rhyming words, he will have no problems cutting down that line, because he will have figured out how to control those scissors and make them do what he wants them to do. Isn't that the point of cutting? I observed a student the other day, and she commented that the child who was cutting beside her was usually crazy with his scissors and just cut all willy-nilly. And yet what I observed was a child cutting so carefully around these objects. Come to find out, they were objects that he painted and drew, that he was invested in, and he was cutting them out to put them in a group picture. A child who's willy-nilly with cutting was showing that he had the dexterity. He had the hand-eye coordination to cut around complex shapes, to freehand cut, essentially, because he wasn't cutting on a line. He was cutting, an object around it, almost like bubble cutting. And he was able to do it precisely because he was motivated. And he had already figured out through his willy-nilly play with scissors how to control those scissors. So my point is sometimes DAP might look willy-nilly, and we have to really think about what the opportunity is we're giving and how the children are thinking during those opportunities. That is the same thing through all of this. Holding a trowel. Look at the different ways the kids are holding those rakes and shovels. Some of them are having to use two hands. The little girl in the purple sweatshirt is holding her shovel in a very odd way, which tells me she's kind of weak in the forearm. Well, she needs to dig more so she'll get strong in the forearm. So she can be like this little boy sitting in the dirt with the trowel digging a hole with one hand. So she can be like that little girl whisking. And again, look at how that girl's whisking. She's going to whisk differently than you or I would whisk because of strength, right? The boy kneading the bread is having to use his whole hand, but at times he'll use his fingers and then he'll have to use his whole hand because his fingers are going to get tired. Another observation I did recently, children were playing with clay instead of Play-Doh. And they were having a hard time because clay is hard to use sometimes, right? But they were building persistence and they were building their hand strength. And then you give them beads to stick in the clay and they're having to use that pincer grasp that I was talking about. Open-ended art instead of worksheets. Writing centers instead of worksheets. Goes back to that principle on motivation. Those children are going to write their names, they're going to cut, they're going to color. They are all working towards making a picture that's meaningful. And given enough experience, you will see growth in their work. One of my most favorite things when I taught kindergarten was taking the children's self-portraits that they drew at the beginning of each quarter. And then they drew one at the end of the year. So there were 5 of them. And we lined them up for the parents. It almost made me cry most years to do that with every child. Seeing that growth, seeing how they progressed in their ability, where their arms went. At first, a lot of times in kindergarten, we're blobs with arms coming out where our ears should be. And by the end of kindergarten, there they were with full-on outfits and details such as earrings and freckles and ball caps. So when given enough opportunity, the children developed amazing fine motor skills. They could write all their letters. They could write their first, last, and middle name. They were writing stories, but all at their own levels. When we make a card rather than copy a sentence, we're writing sentences. But every child's able to really address and operate at their level. And then through your interaction with them, they get pushed to go to the next level. The writing in the top left-hand corner of the string does a really great job of showing the beginnings of writing, of how you go from your scribbles to your drawings to your stringing of letters. No lines. They're not ready for them yet, but they will be. They will be in months if they just have the opportunity to keep going. Developmentally appropriate practices are really tough to implement. I want to go back here to the front. It is hard because a lot of it relies on you deciding the cornerstones and making sure to remember and reflect upon those 9 principles. I was in a training earlier this week on reading. It was a professional development day that I took to participate in this training on reading, where they really focused on what the science is of how to teach reading. And we know, unfortunately, across the United States, that even though we know the research and we know the science of how to teach reading, overall, we are failing to do it as a profession. And this goes from preschool all the way through high school, and arguably into your community colleges and universities, that we are failing to teach reading and writing in a way that is supported by scientific research. And the trainers directly addressed this idea that in our classrooms, in our work, there often becomes a lot of tradition. And we have to start thinking as if this tradition is appropriate. And is the tradition context, or do we need to push back a little bit on the tradition? You guys could probably guess my position on it, but it doesn't matter what my opinion is. You are the ones in the classrooms having to make these tough decisions. And so you have to come up with that balance and figure it out for your own children and your own programs and your own communities of what that balance is for your context, your application of the commonality in development and learning, and knowing your individual children.